Alright everybody, welcome to the third volume of the Disturbing Rabbit Hole collection. We're going over a range of dark and unsettling cases today, ranging from illegal human experimentation programs ran by the United States government, all the way to a man who woke up behind a Burger King, severely beaten and bruised with amnesia, who would spend the next decade of his life trying to figure out who he was. These are just some of the wild stories we're going to be covering today, so grab a snack, get comfortable, and shut the blinds, because this is volume 3 of the Disturbing Rabbit Hole collection. On the night of December 28, 1956, the two Grimes sisters, Barbara and Patricia, aged 15 and 12, went to see Elvis's movie Love Me Tender in Brighton Park, Chicago. Although sources vary, it was somewhere between their 11th and 15th time seeing the movie since it was released just over a month earlier. They were also members of Elvis's official fan club. The girls lived in nearby McKinley Park and were known to either walk or catch a bus to the movie theater over the past month when they wanted to see the film. On this particular night, after promising their mother that they would return home by midnight and with a total of $2.50 on hand, they left the home at around 7:30 to make their way to the theater, located around a mile and a half away. There were numerous sightings of the girls that night, one of which came from Patricia's school friend named Dorothy Weinert, who happened to sit behind the girls during the screening with her own sister. However, as it was a double feature, these two ended up leaving at the intermission around 9:30. According to them, the two sisters seemed to be acting normally. Both were in good spirits, and nothing stood out about their behavior. The Grimes sisters would stay at the theater to watch the second screening, again playing Love Me Tender. Still, they should have been able to head home after the second screening and make it back just before midnight. However, at the family home, midnight would come and go with no sign of the girls. Soon after, their mother Loretta sent two of her other children, 17-year-old Teresa and 14-year-old Joey, to wait for their sisters by the nearby bus stop until they all made it back safely. When 3 separate buses passed without the girls showing up, they returned back to the house. In the meantime, their mother had already tried to contact the girls' friends in the hopes that they had gone back home with one of them. However, none of the families she contacted had her daughters. When Joey and Teresa returned back to the house empty-handed, Loretta flipped, and at 2:15 a.m., reported the girls as missing with the Chicago Police Department. It didn't take long for hundreds of police officers to join together, creating one of the largest missing persons cases ever held within the Chicago area. A task force was eventually created with the sole intent of finding the girls. The resulting search included the emptying of canals and rivers, the assistance of hundreds of local volunteers, and the distribution of more than 15,000 flyers, as well as the questioning of 300,000 people. Out of these questionings, there were actually 2 people who ended up being arrested, with one of them, Edward Bedwell, actually confessing to a crime. However, despite this, neither of the arrests would lead to anyone actually being charged. Many have said that Bedwell held a resemblance to Elvis Presley, which might be an extremely important detail, as several teenagers who had been at the theater on the night of December 28th told the authorities that they had actually witnessed the sisters climbing into the vehicle of a young man who apparently resembled Elvis Presley. We'll dive deeper into who exactly Edward Bedwell was and how he might have been involved in a moment. The police suspected that the girls had simply ran away from home, or that they had traveled south to see Elvis in concert, where he would soon be playing in Nashville, Tennessee. However, their parents denied that this was in their nature and insisted that they were very well-behaved girls. Still, investigators failed to treat the case as seriously as the situation deserved until an entire week had passed without any contact from the two sisters. On the 19th of January, Elvis Presley's Graceland estate would officially make a televised statement in an attempt to convince the girls to return home. Elvis himself would also speak on the radio, sharing a similar message. However, these efforts would unfortunately turn out to have been made in vain. Just 3 days later, on the 22nd of January, the snow began to melt along a country road, some 12 miles southeast of where the girls had disappeared from the theater nearly an entire month earlier. A man named Leonard Prescott had been driving on his way to Willow Springs to buy some groceries when he barely caught a glimpse of, quote, these flesh-colored things laying beyond a guardrail along a road passing over a creek. He would continue on before returning later with his wife to investigate what he had seen. He would have to carry his fainted wife back to the car. Lying on the side of the road, the two would discover the naked, frozen bodies of the two sisters. The husband and wife contacted the Willow Springs Police Department as quickly as they were able. Barbara's body was found to have 3 separate wounds, resembling an attack by an ice pick, along with evidence of blunt force trauma to her head. Patricia's body contained numerous bruises. Shortly thereafter, their father was taken to the crime scene to confirm the bodies as those of his 2 daughters. No other significant information was uncovered at the scene. It simply seemed that somebody had taken these girls' bodies, driven them to the side of the road, and threw them both into the ditch. Following the autopsy, the coroners believed that the girls passed away the night that they disappeared on the 28th of December, or at the very latest, the next morning on the 29th. No drugs, alcohol, or poisons were found within either of the girls' bodies, and as a result of the injuries that both of them appeared to have sustained, the cause of death was ruled as a murder. Other than the reported sightings of the girls climbing into a vehicle with a man at the theater, several other significant sightings were reported throughout the investigation. However, keep in mind that none of these sightings have ever been confirmed and are all just reports. Several people reported seeing the two sisters on a bus, which they got off of around half the way back to their home at 11:05 p.m. One man named Roger Menard also attended the movie and saw the girls sitting nearby him. On his way back home, walking along Archer Avenue, he reports having seen 2 different cars pull up alongside the girls. First, a green Buick, and later a black 1949 Mercury containing 2 teenage boys. He didn't see them climb inside either of the cars, however, just giggling before continuing towards their home. Somewhat contradictory to the time and date of death given in the autopsy report, however, there were several different sightings on the 29th of December, the day after the movie. One by a security guard who claims to have offered directions to the girls that morning, and another when Judy Burrow, an actual friend of Barbara's, told investigators that she had seen her walking westward, again on Archer Avenue. Another girl associated with the sisters, Catherine Borak, who was a classmate of Patricia's, reportedly was certain that she saw Patricia walk past a restaurant she had been inside on the evening of the 29th. She had apparently been with 2 other girls who she wasn't able to identify. A final sighting was reported after the personal pleas from Elvis on TV and radio, when Chicago Sun-Times columnist Ann Landers was sent a letter from an anonymous girl who claims to have seen both of the sisters being forced inside of a vehicle on the night of December the 28th. However, the author's authenticity couldn't ever be traced or verified. Again, because many of these reports contradict with the coroner's believed time of death being between the late hours of the 28th or early into the 29th, it's hard to verify any of these claims. Let's go back to Edward Bedwell, the man who had actually confessed to the crime, but never ended up being found guilty. The man, who again apparently looked like Elvis, worked in a restaurant owned by John and Minnie Durrows, who both alleged that in the early morning of December 30th, Edward and another young man had been seen on the property along with two girls who they claim resembled the Grimes sisters. On the 24th of January, this information was given to the police, and Edward Bedwell was arrested and interrogated by them for 3 days. He was temporarily charged with the murders on the 27th of January after signing a 14-page confession to the crime in which it is stated that he and a 28-year-old man named William Cole Willingham had been in the company of the girls on the 30th, and that they had been together until the 7th of January, drinking in different bars along West Madison Street. He states that apparently after giving the girls hot dogs, they had beaten them and thrown both of their bodies into a ditch filled with snow when they denied their sexual advances. Bedwell would eventually revoke this confession after Willingham continued to deny his own involvement. He explained that he only provided the confession because by this point, he had been held for 4 days by the police and held the belief that if he provided the confession, he would be able to leave. I'm not exactly sure why he believed that confessing to a crime would lead him to be released, but that isn't really elaborated in any of the information I could find. While in custody, he was apparently threatened, bribed, and physically harmed by the officers, which meant that the confession had to be thrown out the window. There would unfortunately be very few other significant developments in the case, and we still really don't know who committed these murders. They likely walked free of the situation for many years to come, and it's completely possible that even to this day, they are still living among us. For those of you who have been following the earlier volumes in this series, you'll remember the story of J.C. Dugard, who was kidnapped at the age of 11 and held in captivity for 18 years, where she was abused and forced to have 2 children with her captor. This story is similar to hers in many ways, but in others, it is somehow even more terrifying. On the 19th of May, 1977, a 20-year-old woman named Colleen Stan had been on her way from her home in Eugene, Oregon, to visit her friend in Northern California for a friend's birthday party. She planned to get there by hitchhiking her way south along Interstate 5. Colleen claimed to have been an experienced hitchhiker and, as a result, was careful with whose vehicles she climbed into that day, apparently allowing several different cars to pass by before a blue van would come to a stop, offering her a ride. Inside were husband and wife 23-year-old Cameron and 19-year-old Janice Hooker, along with their 18-month-old baby. The group seemed to be nothing more than an ordinary family out for a drive. The husband looked dirty, like he just got off work. His young wife was holding their baby. They told me, "Yeah, we'll give you a ride." I felt this was a good ride, a safe ride after evaluating the situation. Feeling confident, Colleen climbed inside, and the 4 began heading south. At one point in their drive, they would stop at a gas station for a break, and Colleen exited the vehicle to use the bathroom. Years later, she would state, "A voice told me to run and jump out a window and never look back." In a decision that would come to haunt her, she returned to the vehicle and the group pulled away. A short while later, Cameron would stop the car in a remote area under the guise of being interested in the nearby caves. At this point, Cameron's wife Janice would take their baby and walk down to a nearby lake to play, while Colleen and Cameron remained back at the van, before he would climb into the back seat with the woman and hold a knife to her throat. He would proceed to tie her up and place a strange box over her head. Cameron, who turned out to be a carpenter, designed the 20-pound contraption specifically to fit snugly on the wearer's head and isolate them from the outside world. The inside was lined with soundproofing, making it impossible to see, hear, and very difficult to breathe. She was then taken to the couple's home in Red Bluff, California, a 344-mile drive from Colleen's home in Eugene. There, Colleen would be dragged downstairs into the cellar, raped and tortured before she was placed in a wooden box measuring 3 feet by 6 feet, where she was left for the rest of the night. The majority of the next 7 years of her life would be spent inside of that box. According to her, she would spend 23 hours a day inside, only being removed to be tortured and abused. In an interview with Closer, she stated, "I was stretched on racks, electrocuted, whipped until I bled, and tied up by my wrists, and left to hang for hours on end." 7 months into her captivity, Cameron would approach her with a contract, which he forced her to sign, that stated that Cameron owned her and that she would agree to obey his every command for the rest of her life. He told me he belonged to a very powerful international organization called The Company. He compared it to the mafia and said if I ran away, they'd come and get me. He told me I'd be nailed to a cross and left for days. And by then, I was so broken, I believed him. After signing the contract, I was allowed out of the box for an hour a day to clean their house. After some time, the family moved away to a mobile home, obviously without a basement to keep the woman in. Instead, they constructed a new box, this time essentially a coffin which she would have to lay down inside of. The box would then be stored underneath their waterbed. Reportedly, despite a set of holes placed in the lid of the box for ventilation, Colleen would be trapped inside in excess of 100 degrees during the summer months. Now that you have an idea of how terribly this woman was treated, we're going to discuss a very strange aspect of this case that seems to be sort of a trend among these long-term kidnappings. And that's that Cameron and Janice would actually let Colleen out of the box to either clean the house or babysit the kids while they left. This was still only for short periods of time, usually no more than an hour or two each day, but it seemed that she had plenty of different opportunities to escape, with access to a phone, neighbors, as well as the ability to just walk out the door. The only thing more terrifying than the physical abuse and the captivity that she endured was the mental control that these people had over her. Nothing would prove the extent of these chains more than when Colleen and her captor went on a trip to visit her parents some 3 years into her captivity. Remarkably, Cameron, posing as her boyfriend, would in fact drive Colleen back up to Eugene, Oregon to visit her family in 1981. They had concluded that the two were in a cult, citing her homemade clothes and strange behavior, but out of fear of her remaining separated from the family, they didn't pry for too much information or try to coerce her to leave the group. While there, this photo was taken of Colleen and Cameron, which really just goes to show how brainwashed this woman really was into doing whatever Cameron wanted her to do, and how completely submissive she was to his demands. Even more shocking, Cameron would even leave Colleen alone with her family overnight. At no point did she ever reveal the way she had been treated over the last 3.5 years, how she had been abused, kidnapped, kept in a box all day. None of it. The following day, she would return back to the mobile home with Cameron, where he would come to the conclusion that he had given his slave too much freedom, and as a result, would return to keeping her locked in the box for 23 hours a day underneath the bed for the next 3.5 years. This entire time, Colleen hadn't been allowed to use her real name. At one point, Cameron said to her, "I'm in control and Colleen no longer exists. You are now Kay. You are my slave." And from that moment on, she was only called Kay. Cameron even handed her a gun towards the beginning of her captivity and told her, "This is to see if you'll do what I say," before instructing her to put it in her mouth and pull the trigger without informing her if the weapon was loaded or not. She did as he asked, and luckily, it was in fact just a test. Now, I'm sure you recall that during the kidnapping, the couple had brought their young child with them. Whatever happened to that baby while all of this was going on? In fact, the family had 2 daughters while Colleen was held captive inside the home. When asked about the situation years later, they explained that neither of them were even aware that she had been inside the house the entire time, let alone in a box underneath their parents' bed. This couple told their children that she went home at the end of each day and were able to hide this from the 2 of them for years. Only after the children had gone to sleep would she be pulled out again from under the bed, fed, and tortured. She was not allowed to make any noise while inside. Things started to shift in the year 1983, when she was allowed to get a job as a maid at a nearby hotel. Soon after, Cameron would tell her and Janice that she was interested in making Colleen his second wife. This didn't sit well with Janice, especially after he also admitted that he wanted a second slave. Before long, in August of 1984, Janice chose to bring this horrific era to an end. She went to Colleen and told her that everything they had said about the company was a lie. There was no secret group that would track her down and harm her or her family if she did manage to get away. After confessing this, she helped her to escape. I didn't feel any anger towards Cameron or Janice while I was held captive. The only emotion I felt was terror. But once I started to feel safe again, the anger came. Janice informed her that she had been abused and manipulated by Cameron too, brainwashed, tortured, and tormented since their first date. After being released from the mobile home, Colleen went to a bus station and, in a strange decision, got on the phone to call Cameron, informing him that she was leaving him, which apparently he only responded to by bursting into tears. She then hung up, boarded the bus, and returned home to Oregon. Even more peculiar, she was apparently so brainwashed that she didn't even call the police. Instead, she would continue to call her kidnapper many different times over the next several months. This was elaborated upon in the later trial, where she explained that Janice had requested that she give him a second chance to change for the better, which is, of course, a ridiculous idea, but it seems that it took a very long time for her brainwashing to start to fade away. 3 months would go by like this before the police were called on Cameron. Not by Colleen, but by Janice. She informed the Red Bluff police that her husband had kidnapped, tortured, and murdered a woman named Marie Elizabeth Spanicky, who disappeared the year prior to Colleen's kidnapping. Colleen would later recall seeing a photo of this woman in view from the box she was kept in. However, unfortunately, the body of this woman was never found, and no charges could be pressed against Cameron. Janice ended up testifying against her husband during the trial, in exchange for which she received full immunity. Cameron Hooker was found guilty for his crimes and was sentenced to 104 years in prison. His wife Janice went free as a result of her role in convicting Cameron. She claimed she was also a victim of his and would go on to become a social worker and a mental health professional. Colleen would attempt to live a normal life, studying for an accounting degree, before eventually writing a book about her horrifying experience. It was early in the morning on August 31st, 2004, still dark outside, when a manager at a Burger King in Richmond Hill, Georgia, located just off of US Route 17, walked out behind the restaurant towards the dumpster. Lying beside it was a naked man, sunburned and covered in bites from fire ants. The manager immediately called the police, reporting that he had found a bum behind his restaurant. Paramedics would arrive shortly after and take the man to St. Joseph's Hospital in Savannah, where 3 impressions were found on the right side of the man's skull, caused by blunt force trauma. There, he wasn't able to give doctors any useful information. When he finally started talking, he stated that he had lived in the woods for 17 years. When asked about his name, he simply said, "They call me BK around here." When she corrected him, asking again for his real name, he again said, "BK, but you're getting me confused," before going silent. Emergency workers were unable to identify the man. Again, he had no clothes at all, let alone a wallet or any identifying documents. The police report indicates that the man had been found unconscious and sweaty, but breathing. He appeared to have been left out in the sun for hours before being discovered. As the days went on, he began speaking, though in short, incoherent, and often aggressive bursts, claiming that the nurses were beasts and demons. He would punch in their direction and spit at them. They quickly began to believe that the man had more mental problems than they had originally suspected, and transferred him to the psych ward at Memorial Health University Medical Center. Due to the lack of information available on the man, he was simply entered into the records as Burger King Doe. Even several weeks after the discovery of the man, doctors were still unable to determine his identity. 2 weeks after his discovery, his state would be recorded as semi-conscious. He was quickly diagnosed with catatonic schizophrenia following his outbursts and prescribed Haldol, a powerful antipsychotic. After some time, he would slowly regain his lucidity, but terrifyingly, the man could barely remember any information about his life at all. He had no idea where he lived, what his name was, or how he had even ended up in Georgia. He recalled various random memories which failed to paint any sort of a picture as to who he was. The only fact he seemed to be certain of was his birthday, August 29th, 1948. Eventually, he would claim to remember that his name was Benjamin, spelled with 2 A's, but failed to recall his last name, ending up giving himself the surname Kyle. Benjaman Kyle had cataracts in both of his eyes, and around 9 months after he was found, had corrective surgery following a charity event, which raised money for him to be able to afford the operation. Upon looking at himself in the mirror for the first time since his discovery, he was fairly disturbed to see that he was some 20 years older than he had believed himself to have been. When I looked in the mirror, I could not believe how gray my hair was and how old I was. There's a bunch of years missing, and I don't know what happened. Over the next few years, he would be in and out of hospitals, long-term care facilities, and shelters, eventually ending up at the J.C. Lewis Health Center in November of 2004. One of the worst parts about his predicament was that without a social security number, it was impossible for him to legally work in the United States or receive any government help. Instead, for a time, he would simply do work at the medical center, performing maintenance on the building, changing beds, and even helping with patients in exchange for shelter, food, and medical assistance free of charge. Still, with time, he realized he couldn't go on living his life like this, and eventually left the health center in search of a regular life, in spite of his amnesia, working jobs where he could be paid under the table to support himself as best as he could, while he essentially couch-surfed between the homes of friends he had made so far. Desperate to figure out who he was and to return to as normal of a life as possible, Kyle would return to the Burger King he was found behind on several different occasions, hoping to jog his memory, which he was never able to do. He would even walk around the Richmond Hill area where he was found, speaking to most of the motel and restaurant owners in the area about an abandoned car or any record of him having been there before his discovery. Again, his attempts were futile. He slowly would begin to feel that he was remembering different bits of information about his life, stating that he believed he had 3 brothers, but that he can't remember their names or what they looked like. Kyle would continue to try and jog his memory or discover any facts that could serve as the missing link to his family and old life. He didn't have any memories from Richmond Hill, and instead believes that he had memories in the states of Indiana or Colorado, though he isn't sure if he could have been from any specific towns or cities within either of those 2 states. He also spent plenty of time searching through missing persons websites across the internet, hoping to come across his photo, but still no dice. He even sent his fingerprints to the National Criminal Justice Information Services Division in West Virginia, where his prints were ran through databases containing those obtained from criminals, crime scene evidence, and every single armed services member on file. They even checked to see if he was listed in the Witness Protection Program. Nothing. He would appear on the Dr. Phil show in December of 2008 in an attempt to spread his face, name, and story as far as possible, with the hope that someone would remember who he was and get into contact with him. Unfortunately, even appearing on national television was a dead end. His identity would remain a mystery for over a decade. Until September 16th, 2015, when Kyle would write to his Facebook page announcing that he had finally uncovered his identity. A little over 2 months ago, I was informed by CC Moore that they had established my identity using DNA. Many people have shared their DNA profiles so that they may be compared with mine. Through a process of elimination, they determined my ancestral bloodline and who my relatives were. A DNA test taken by a close relative has confirmed that we are related. A year later, his actual name was revealed to the public to have been William Burgess Powell. It turns out that he had actually correctly recalled his birthday as August 29th, 1948. He was also correct in recalling that he lived in Indiana. He had been born in Lafayette, Indiana, and grew up there before, in 1976, he apparently broke away from his family, abandoning everything he owned, including his car and trailer. A missing persons report was filed, but they were unable to locate William. It was then discovered that he eventually moved to Boulder, Colorado with a coworker, which was backed up by some of the memories that he seemed to have kind of floating around in his head while tracking down his identity. However, even with this massive stride, there's still a huge gap in the timeline of his life. He seems to have worked a variety of different jobs until the mid-1980s, after which there are no records of him until his discovery behind the Burger King in 2004, 20 years later. He's now doing his best to return to a normal life. Andrew Joseph Stack worked as an embedded software consultant and business owner who lived in Austin, Texas in the year 2010, aged 53. Initially working as a contract software engineer, he became frustrated when he tried to claim a tax deduction for attending college, but was disallowed from doing so. Then, in 1986, when he was 30 years old, the Tax Reform Act of 1986 was passed, containing a section which made it much more difficult for software engineers to be classified as contractors. This would be a big financial blow to his business, as his tax liabilities increased significantly. He felt that the legislation greedily and unfairly targeted business owners like himself. He would attempt to spark protests, get the attention of politicians, and organize groups in order to fight the law, but ultimately failed. Over the years, his hatred for the IRS and other American tax authorities would grow, eventually leading to him attempting to exploit a tax loophole given to churches by labeling his house as the Church of the Common Man. This obviously didn't end up working out, getting him into more trouble with the IRS. The whole scheme reportedly ended up costing him over $40,000 and completely drained the entirety of his retirement savings. Over the following years, he ended up going through a divorce and his business tanked. He moved to Austin, Texas in the hopes of avoiding the high tax rates in the state of California. In 1994, after having an entire year without making any money, he figured he didn't need to file a tax return at all. But that isn't how it works, and he ended up being slammed with a $10,000 fine. In the early 2000s, he would be audited by the IRS, which quickly revealed that he had failed to collect and report his wife's income. By this point, Stack had lost his retirement numerous different times, and he blamed the United States government and the IRS. On February 17th, 2010, his wife ended up taking their daughter to a hotel because Joseph had apparently become violent in response to the injustices he believes he suffered. The very next day, Stack published a manifesto to his website where he detailed his outrage with the American tax system and the government as a whole, ending the letter with the following: "Violence not only is the answer, it is the only answer. The cruel joke is that the really big chunks of shit at the top have known this all along and have been laughing at and using this awareness against fools like me all along. I saw it written once that the definition of insanity is repeating the same process over and over and expecting the outcome to suddenly be different. I am finally ready to stop this insanity. Well, Mr. Big Brother IRS man, let's try something different. Take my pound of flesh and sleep well. The Communist Creed, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. The Capitalist Creed, from each according to his gullibility, to each according to his greed. Joe Stack, 1956 to 2010. After setting his own house ablaze, Joseph Stack drove to Georgetown Municipal Airport where he rented a hangar to house his single-engine Piper Dakota airplane. He took off at approximately 9:45 a.m. and, just 10 minutes later, crashed at full speed into Echelon 1, a building which housed an IRS field office. His last words to the control tower were, "Thanks for your help. Have a great day." The attack resulted in the deaths of Joseph Stack as well as IRS manager Vernon Hunter. 13 other people were injured. Ironically, the IRS was forced to spend $38.6 million of taxpayer funds on repairing the building, recovering the documents lost in the explosion, and increasing security at IRS offices nationwide. starting in the year 1932, members of the United States Public Health Service, along with members of the CDC, came to rural Alabama's small city of Tuskegee, as well as the greater Macon County area, with the apparent intentions of treating local impoverished black men for, quote, bad blood. A local term used to describe a variety of different possible health conditions, such as anemia, fatigue, and syphilis. The men were offered completely free medical care, burial insurance, and meals provided to them during their exams and treatment, along with transportation to and from medical facilities, all apparently free of charge, courtesy of the US government. These men would receive routine blood tests, x-rays, and other examinations, which, to them, reassured their belief that they were being properly taken care of. However, this couldn't have been farther from the truth. The majority of these 600 men were, in reality, victims of a horrific, racist, human experimentation program which would span for 40 years, completely undetected by the larger population or even the victims themselves. The Public Health Service and CDC weren't trying to offer help to the poor black sharecroppers of rural Alabama. Instead, they had purposefully sought out 399 men who were infected with syphilis, along with 201 others as a control group, and, without the informed consent of those being studied, began tracking how the disease took hold of the victims' bodies and slowly robbed them of their health. The entire time, they intentionally withheld the fact that they were infected with the illness at all, preventing them from acquiring outside help. Even worse, by the 1940s, it was widely known that the antibiotic penicillin was effective in treating syphilis. But still, the doctors deliberately prevented their patients from receiving this treatment, instead offering them a variety of disguised placebos and other ineffective methods of treatment for whatever symptoms they were experiencing as a result of the disease. Scientists at the time believed that syphilis affected blacks differently than other races, and as such, wanted to study how the disease affected them specifically before studying them after their death during the autopsies. The initial study had the goal of following untreated syphilis in a group of African American men for 6 months, and 1 year at the very longest, before eventually treating them. This still would have been extremely unethical, as withholding the treatment and lying about the true nature of their business with these men is unacceptable for any period of time. However, when their funding was withdrawn, the second treatment phase was deemed to be too expensive. Instead, they continued to monitor the men and continued to withhold their diagnoses and treatment. Many members in the community had even recruited others for the experiment. Black doctors, pastors, teachers, and other local authority figures were led to believe that their community was being given an amazing opportunity, meaning many of the unknowing neighbors of the eventual victims had unknowingly persuaded them to enter into a program that would come to severely harm their health. As a result of their failure to disclose proper treatment options, or again, the fact that they even had the disease at all, victims went blind, experienced neurological issues, or died as a result of their illness. In many cases, they also spread it to their families and friends. This would continue from the beginning of the experiment in 1932 all the way until 1972, 40 years later. Its end would stem from one Peter Buxton, a 27-year-old public health worker who was hired by the Public Health Service in 1965. He was tasked with interviewing patients with sexually transmitted diseases, which led to his introduction to the Tuskegee Experiment, which he was informed about from those he worked with. The following year, he filed an internal protest with the service's Division of Venereal Diseases, but was rejected due to the fact that the experiment was still ongoing. He tried again in 1968, but faced the same outcome, when his concerns were deemed to be, quote, irrelevant. Unable to spark change internally, Peter would end up leaking the existence of the experiment to the Associated Press, sparking a massive amount of public outrage. 28 of those being studied had died directly as a result of the illness, 100 had died of related health complications, and 19 of their children were born with congenital syphilis. In 1974, the NAACP filed a class action lawsuit against the United States Public Health Service, along with other agencies involved in the study. They sought justice for the families who had been experimented upon or had passed away as a result. The lawsuit as a whole concluded with a $9 million lawsuit being paid out to the survivors and families of those affected. It's pretty remarkable to me how this event isn't discussed more often, given how many people's lives were directly affected. In late July of 1975, a tropical cyclone dubbed Typhoon Nina formed over the Pacific Ocean before striking Taiwan and China. As it made landfall on the continent, it dissipated into a tropical storm, eventually reaching the Banqiao Dam area, located within China's Henan province. The Banqiao Dam, along with many others in the surrounding area, began their construction back in the early 50s during the Great Leap Forward, headed by Mao Zedong, when China was attempting to shift away from their agricultural economy into an industrialized society. At the time, the Chinese really didn't know how to construct these dams to retain large amounts of water, as they were now trying to do, leading them to enlist the help of the Soviet Union. However, because the Chinese were inexperienced in the construction of such a large water-retaining project, many issues with the construction quality of the dam and shoddy maintenance practices plagued the rigidity of the structure. At the time, the dam was designated to withstand what the Chinese dubbed a 1-in-1,000-year rainfall event of 300 millimeters of rain per day. However, when Typhoon Nina made landfall in 1975, an entire year's worth of rain fell in just one day. And it wasn't 300 millimeters of rain. It wasn't 600 millimeters. It wasn't even 900 millimeters. The typhoon produced 1,060 millimeters of rain near its epicenter, and several days into the month of August, things were starting to look grim. There were a variety of communication failures as the storm spread throughout the country, making it difficult for dam workers to receive instructions for managing the extreme amounts of rainfall. On the 6th of August, workers attempted a request to open the dam, but due to the already severe floods, which were occurring downstream already, the request was rejected. The following day, on the 7th of August, the intense rainfall caused the water levels in the Banqiao Reservoir to rise at an extremely fast rate. They were finally sent permission to open the dam via telegram, a message which would fail to reach the workers entirely, who had no other choice but to keep the dam closed. Even though they were aware of how severe the situation was becoming, they were hesitant to act without the approval of their higher-ups. Furthermore, the sluice gates ended up failing due to sedimentation blockage. It's essential that these gates are able to open so that the dam can release water into the river system they're built on top of. When sluice gates fail, they make it impossible for the dam to release pressure, creating the potential for an extremely dangerous situation. By the night of August 7th, when it became clear that the dam was malfunctioning and the unprecedented rainfall was still slamming the region, local authorities began evacuating residents who lived downstream. Still, the true threat wasn't understood at all. It was thought that some more flash flooding could occur once the water overtopped the dam, but in reality, nobody expected exactly what would happen. By 1:00 a.m. on August 8th, the water did in fact overtop the dam and began spilling over into the Rue River before the entire dam collapsed. It's estimated that some 700 million cubic meters of water were released in just 6 hours, creating a massive wave nearly 6.5 miles wide and up to 23 feet high, which barreled downstream. The floodwaters stormed ahead at speeds of up to 50 kilometers per hour, smashing into villages, towns, and agricultural property. Countless buildings, homes, and other structures were decimated. Even worse, the powerful release of water subsequently triggered the collapse of 62 other dams in the area, compounding the devastation significantly. It's hard to truly comprehend the extent of the damage that was caused by the dam's failure. It's estimated that anywhere between 85,000 and 240,000 people were killed as a result of the flood, and somehow, even more shockingly, upwards of 5 million homes were completely obliterated. In the days following the disaster, the Chinese military was deployed to the area, along with emergency services and rescue workers, though it was very difficult for many of them to reach the most devastated areas due to the floodwater and the damaged infrastructure. Those who weren't killed immediately as a result of the flood were then left to fend for themselves in a decimated and unrecognizable region torn by disease and famine. In the weeks following the initial flood wave, there were still over 1 million people who were stranded and trapped by the waters, completely cut off from relief workers and other rescue efforts. They were airdropped food and supplies to keep them alive until they could hopefully be reached as soon as possible. To the surprise of no one, the Chinese Communist Party banned public discussion of the disaster, and the news media was barred from talking about it. Due to the political tensions at the time, China wanted to maintain a strong, stable image, and as a result, the true extent of the disaster wasn't known to the public for many years. Slowly, information was leaked during the 80s and 90s when the disaster was still considered a state secret, until 2005 when the official documents were declassified. Still, the Chinese government continued to downplay the reports even then, with their reported death toll being much lower than independent reports, at just 26,000 people. And that concludes the third volume of the Disturbing Rabbit Hole collection. I plan on making these a little bit more frequent in the future, so if you have any other disturbing cases that you'd like to see me cover in the next episode, be sure to leave those in the comments.